Shalom WJC family. It is time for our weekly Torah talk. This week in Shul we will read Parshat Tetzaveh, but more importantly at the moment it is Parshat Zachor, the Parshat known as Remember. It's the day we read a passage about remembering Amalek. On Monday night into Tuesday we'll celebrate Purim, joyous holiday, but also one that reminds us that there's anti-Semitism in the world, that sometimes nasty people full of hatred, like Haman from the story of Esther and Shushan, and so many throughout our history have risen against us. And so Shabbat Zachor, we read a special maftir about the Amalekites. Haman is a spiritual, at least, descendant of the Amalekites, and in our tradition, many, if not all, anti-Semites are spiritual descendants of the Amalekites. It raises a question today as anti-Semitism is once again on the rise in America and around the world, and everyone's trying to figure out what to do about it. People are full of anxiety. Last week there was a scare, a rumor, a day planned on the internet by an otherwise insignificant neo-Nazi group. They like to do a lot of flyers and signs and things, and so many of our synagogues and institutions had to beef up our security because we were nervous. The question is, what are we supposed to do in a time of anti-Semitism? And I wanted to bring a teaching that I learned recently of Rebbe Nachman of Bratzlav. He's actually talking perhaps about prayer. He's talking about when God feels far away. And I think times of persecution, times of anti-Semitism are certainly times when God feels distant. Famously, God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah. You know, it's one of those of Megillat Esther of Purim. It's one of those questions. Why is God's name not written? Because when we're being persecuted, we tend to feel that God is distant, that God is far away. So this teaching of Rebbe Nachman says there are times when the flow of God's energy and God's sort of mochin, God's mentalities, God's intelligence in the world, the sense of God's intelligence in the world is blocked off. And this, he says, is like, he compares it to pregnancy. Now, why pregnancy? It seems odd. On initial reading, I thought it was that when someone is pregnant, the life is hidden from them, there to be revealed, God willing, but somehow covered up and hidden. And so what does he say? He says, then, V'az yafat tza'aka la'adam. The person should shout out, tza'aka, cry out, in prayer or Torah, or maybe between his prayer and his Torah, maybe just a guttural cry. Rebbe Nachman has the idea of a quiet cry. You can cry out silently, which reminded me of that monk painting. Anyway, so he continues on about talking about this whole concept, and it occurred to me that Rebbe Nachman was also living in a time of oppression, a time of real oppression in Eastern Europe, in the time of the Tsars, and things were bad. And when things are bad, God feels far away. And so he has this idea of tza'aka, this idea of crying out. And what happens, he goes on to explain that when a person cries out this cry because God is hidden or God's presence is hidden, in this aspect of gestation or pregnancy, these outcries are like the cries, are like birth pangs. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One, knows how the spiritual flow is hidden and cut off. And God hears our cries. And here's the beautiful part. V'hatza'aka hu bimkom tza'akat hashchina. That our cries, or the outcry, is in place of the cry of the Shechina, of God's presence on earth. Ki'ilu hashchina soeket, as if the Shechina is crying out. Ve'az moledet hamochin, and the flows are born. And was such a beautiful idea to me. Because so often when we face oppression, when we face anti-Semitism or really hatred of any kind, we say, why doesn't God cry out at this? Why isn't God acting on this? And in this case, it sounds like the tza'akah, the outcry, our outcry is God's outcry. It's up to us to shout out and to do something about it. But do what? What do we do in the face of hatred? And this is where I was struck by the brilliance of equating this condition of the hiddenness, the sense that God is far away, is not with us, because how could God be close at a time like this? That there was this idea that it's a pregnant moment. That even when God feels far away because we're dealing with something so difficult, that's a pregnant moment, a moment ripe for creation. And that ultimately needs to be our reaction to these kinds of oppression, to these acts of anti-Semitism, not to cut ourselves off, not to become like the flows of divinity, sealed off, but ultimately to share the beautiful tradition that we have to offer. I was recently reading a speech that Rabbi Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, gave to the General Assembly of the United Federations. I don't know what they were called in the 60s. It's now called Jewish Federations of North America. And he said to them, ultimately, Rabbi Heschel said to them that our tradition is beautiful, this rich, ancient tradition. And that's what we need to be sharing with the world. When we do, that's how the world will know our value. The Amalekites, the anti-Semites will always be around. But it's when we show how much Judaism has to offer of ancient wisdom for us to be proud of, to teach and to share, and to connect with other kinds of wisdom in the world, to make a more beautiful and a better world. That's the best way to fight anti-Semites. That's the best way to fight anti-Semitism. It's not to shout the loudest at the people who are doing the hating, but to shout the loudest in God's place, in a divine way, in a creative way. To invite people to join us in making this world better, in doing tikkun. And as we do that, when we are at our best, that is when the society is there to protect us no matter what. The Amalekites, who we remember on Shabbat Zachor, the anti-Semites, who we remember on Shabbat Zachor, that's when they will be defeated, and that's when we can celebrate as we celebrate the defeat of Haman on Purim. So I hope we can all take the angst that we feel now, this deep cry that we feel inside, and shout it out in a creative way to give birth to good things in the world, things to celebrate like we do on Purim. Wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Purim Sameach, a happy Purim.